So we covered last week the 3 why questions from the scribes and Pharisees, kind of toward the end of chapter 2. He gave 3 responses. Jesus gave 3 responses to those why questions. Do you remember what they were? And they were in 19 and 20, 21 and 22. Do you remember what they were, the responses? What did he talk about in those verses?
That they're not compatible?
Hmm?
The new and old are not compatible?
Yeah, they're not compatible, but he talked about the bridegroom, he talked about the old and new garment, old wineskin and new wine. But, so you kind of just said it, but what was the whole point with Jesus talking about all of that stuff? Like, what's Jesus trying to get across to them? And Angie just said it, so I'll say it. They're not compatible. The way they do things, scribes and Pharisees, is the old way. Okay? What Jesus is bringing is the new way. So, and when you try and blend their old way, which was their own way, and if you try and blend that with God's way, it's not going to work because those two things are not compatible. Do you remember us talking about all of that? Okay. And Jesus is basically saying to these Pharisees and scribes who they think they have taken the kingdom over themselves that they need to conform back to God. All right? They've left God, they need to conform back to God. And that's that Jesus is not going to conform to them, they need to conform to Him. And they need to get themselves back to letting God reign and God rule. Okay, and what He says to do, because they've got it all twisted right now. Now, we talked about another teaching that is taught in the Brotherhood sometimes from this passage about the new wine and the old wineskin and old garment and so forth. Do you remember what that was? What did we talk about? How some people teach that.
You can't put old wineskin into a new, I can't remember that.
Culture.
Culture?
Yeah.
You have to teach and conform to the new culture.
Well, the new culture has to conform to the old doctrine. Yeah. So it's not us. Sometimes it's taught that old church doctrine and the things that you read about in the Bible, they don't hold up anymore in today's world. And so it's taught that, we need to change what's written and make it conform to what we see today in the culture. And that's totally opposite. That's not true at all. You do not do that. What God has said, God has said. We conform to Christ, not Christ to the culture. That's not the way it works. We don't rule. God rules. Okay? God is king. We're not king. So that can't happen. Okay? And so it's false and it's wrong to do that because we can't try and make God adapt to us. We've got to adapt to God. Okay, and we talked a lot about that. But, too many people and congregations think that in order for them to reach the younger crowd, okay, in order for them to reach the younger crowd and be more appealing to everyone, that they need to change the doctrine and teachings so that it's more appealing and easier to accept. They don't want to teach on hard stuff. They would rather focus on numbers and being loose on what the Bible teaches just so that they can be more attractive. Okay, I've seen it. It happens. It's not right. It's not good. But they've championed that idea that nobody likes the old stuff that is in the Bible and the teachings that are in it, and so we need to change it. Okay, and it's easier. We need to change it to what people want. But I'll tell you, I've started to see a growing number of people, younger people, who are interested in what is true and what is original or authentic. I saw it a little bit when we were working with college students. Some of them just wanted what was in the Bible. They told me that. They told us that. They just wanted what was in the text. And they didn't care about another Bible class that was more focused on relationships and dating and so forth, right? They didn't care about all that. Some of them were coming to our classes. They were coming to North Mac, and they wanted just the text because they were sick and tired of what they were getting elsewhere. All right? And so I saw that. I saw that they just wanted truth, really. But they wanted to get down to what the text was saying. And so sometimes when you hear, well, young people want this, right? That's not entirely true. What people want is the truth. And I can tell you that the younger Gen Z right now, they want what's real. They want what's authentic. They do. All right? That's why they follow so many influencers and stuff, and they are influencers and all that stuff. And, you know, it's real. It's real stuff. That's what they like. And so there's a lot of what Jesus there's a lot in what Jesus says here, but we've got to make sure that we're not changing what God said just to cater to someone else. I think at the root of that, that's what we're not doing. Or because we think it will cater to someone else or change what God said to make ourselves feel better. All right? There's a lot of different things that a congregation can do still without changing Scripture. Okay? There's different congregations are dynamic and we do things differently sometimes. That's part of being autonomous. We have the right to do that. That's okay. You don't have to change God's Word to be different. And we need to understand that. We can do some different things, but that doesn't mean you change the teaching. You don't change what God said. All right? Anyway, so in verse 24, all right, they ask the third why question. Why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? What did we talk about with that? Any other thoughts that come to your mind when we talked about verse 24? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. They weren't, that's part of that, absolutely. Jesus and His disciples were not doing anything that was unlawful because God said in Deuteronomy 23:25, you can go pick the heads of grain so long as you don't take a sickle to it. We're not harvesting our neighbor's grain, but look, if you're walking through the field and it's standing grain, sure, pluck them and eat them. I don't care. It's fine to do. But, so God said it is lawful to do, and they're saying it's not lawful to do. So again, they are making law, which comes out of that, the Mishnah, and we'll talk more kind of about that today. But they're making law when it's not their place to make law, basically. All right, so that's up to speed, and now we're in verse 25. So somebody, yeah.
Before we leave,
Yeah.
I really wanted to be here last Sunday. Unfortunately, I had to be across the way. But I loved what you said week before last about we have to be careful. I can't quote how you said it. Maybe you can remember and you can rephrase it. But we have to be careful not to add our customs, for these same reasons. And I loved that. And I see a lesson reading Deuteronomy 23. I don't know, maybe I see that different. I don't see that. I don't understand that to have to do with the Sabbath. I don't see where that is specifically about the Sabbath.
Well, all it was they were calling what they were doing on the Sabbath something unlawful. They were walking through and picking heads of grain, and they're like, hey, you can't do that. Well, Deuteronomy 23:25 said, yes, you can.
Well, I get that. I just didn't see that said anything about the Sabbath. However, in Leviticus 23, and I didn't grab my Bible. I was running late this morning, and it's written in the notes there. Leviticus 23 and somewhere else address the commands for the Sabbath, and one of them calls it a day of total rest, and one of them talks about doing absolutely no work on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Each doesn't define what work is.
Right.
And I agree, the Pharisees, I think from my study on the Pharisees, we tend to think wrong about them sometimes. They were very well versed on the law. They did actually know the law better than most of the Jews in the day. And, they called that into question by adding their own little spin to it. And I think it's very possible, and I may just have to ask when I get there, but I think it's very possible from my study that they were just trying to be as absolute conservative as you could be on the law. And I think sometimes, I think what Christ was saying was, look, you're carrying this too far.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to be careful, like you said 2 weeks ago, not to be, we want to be as conservative as we can. And sometimes we can carry things
Yeah.
too far.
So I did talk about that, guarding against Pharisaical or scribal attitudes. I'm going to preach on that soon, actually, too. If you haven't noticed, I'm preaching through Mark as we teach through it. But I will preach on that, guarding against some of those attitudes that we see. The Pharisees absolutely did know the law. There was no question ever about that. These folks knew who God was. They knew the law, all of that. 12 years old, they start memorizing the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So they know this stuff. They just took it way over here to the other side. Right? The pendulum swung way over here to the conservative side. And they started adding stuff to what the Sabbath was. The Sabbath was nothing more than just a day of rest. And I think we'll kind of get down in today's lesson kind of what you're talking about with the Sabbath stuff. They took it so far to where they took one command and they made all this other stuff. That's the whole point about the Mishnah. The Mishnah is all about these teachings from these rabbis that said, here's what you can and can't do on Sabbath. All right? Well, God never said any of that stuff. All He said was you should rest. It's just a day of rest. And now, even today, it's still carried over into today. And I told you, you get caught on Sabbath in Jerusalem, you ain't walking, practically. Okay, I told you, they shut down elevators today because pressing that button inside the elevator is considered a work. They just started overemphasizing everything, like to the point where people couldn't even do anything. Okay, and they were watching too. Are you doing something? Are you doing something? That's what they're doing with Jesus. That's what they're doing with His disciples. What are you about to do? We'll kind of talk about that. Okay, so very good thoughts. But yeah, I think your mind's on the right track with how their attitudes are for sure. Any other questions? Good. As I said, it's very easy when you start studying the Pharisees and their way about doing things. It's very easy to stop and think, do I do that? Do I think like that? It's a dangerous thing to get into, and we need to be very careful. Okay. Someone read 25 and 26, please. All right. It's kind of funny how Jesus responds here, because He says, have you never read? Well, He's talking to guys that most definitely have read or should have read. These are the lawyers of the law, right? And people that do know God's law. And in regard to what Jesus and His disciples are doing about eating the heads of grain on the Sabbath, He says, have you never read about what David did? But He's going to use David as an example here. All right? Jesus is saying that David did something that was not lawful. He did. Because the only people that were supposed to have that showbread, or consecrated bread as it reads, were the priests. We see it in Leviticus 24 verse 9, and I did not put that in there, but it's Leviticus 24:9, okay, that says, only the priests can do that. But what David did when his men got hungry was technically against the law. Now, Jesus says they were in need. Okay? In 1 Samuel 21, chapter 21, is where we can read about what Jesus is talking about. But David was on the run from Saul. Maybe you remember the account there. But he's on the run from Saul. And so when David arrived at a place called Nob, he was in need. And so he asked if there was any bread there, regular bread. But there was not. And the only bread that Ahimelech, the priest, had was the consecrated showbread. And so that was the bread that he ate. But that was technically against the law because that bread was only meant for priests. Okay, now we talked about the Mishnah. All right, the Mishnah, to get a little bit deeper, the Mishnah, though, is within a document called this right here, the Talmud. The Mishnah is within the Talmud. The Talmud is basically an elaboration and explanation of the Mishnah, or all of those different interpretations of the law. And it basically contains commentary and discussion about the Mishnah. Does that make sense? That's what the Talmud is. Mishnah is in the Talmud. Talmud is an explanation of the Mishnah. Okay? But within the Talmud you have explanations from rabbis about how David was not unlawful. And basically saying, no, what David did was okay. And they don't really condemn David for what he did. And remember, they upheld David like they upheld Abraham. So they tried to reconcile and make up all kinds of excuses as to why David was allowed to eat the bread and it not be a violation of law. They loved David. David was their king, right? David was a warrior. They all thought Jesus was going to come like David. That's what was going on. So they thought, no, he didn't violate the law. And so either by saying the priest didn't make the bread correctly that day, or the right utensils weren't used in making the bread, making up all these excuses, right? Maybe they made it on the wrong day and therefore it wasn't consecrated bread, and that's why David was good to go. And so they had basically convinced themselves that the great King David did not break the law. However, Jesus says, no, David did break the law. He wasn't authorized to have that bread. But Jesus is trying to help them see that look, you're condemning me and my disciples for doing what is lawful according to the law, but you ain't said one word about what David did. You're condemning us, and we haven't even broken the law, but you don't condemn David when he actually did. That's what's going on. Jesus is calling out their inconsistency here and saying, if you're going to apply law, you Pharisees, you scribes, if you're going to apply law, then apply God's law and apply it to everybody. And apply it correctly and apply it in the way that God actually intended. You ought to be condemning David and not my disciples, but instead you give David a pass and not my disciples. And the reason for that is because Jesus and His disciples were doing things that did not jive with how they did things. At the root of it. And so what do you do? What do you do with that? Well, you bring the hammer down on people that you don't really like, and people that are doing things that aren't really to your liking, yet you give others a pass because in your eyes they can do no wrong even if they are in the wrong. We need to guard against being inconsistent. That would be another attitude of the Pharisees, Kevin. That's what Jesus is calling them out on here. Now, we can certainly talk about that. In what ways do you think we could be inconsistent with people today? Think about it. How so?
Well, you come to church and act one way, and you can act another way outside the church. Not act like a Christian.
Okay. So we're inconsistent with our actions sometimes.
I think a lot of times we condemn people
Okay.
in a way that, I don't know, I think we view others sometimes or what they've done or are doing, and we tend to maybe shun them a little bit,
Okay. Sometimes we're inconsistent because we condemn people,
even though we're forgiven.
even though we are forgiven. So, kind of a double standard.
I love what Lonnie just said. I have historically been very inconsistent with my own family at times. I think most of us will agree that certainly the so-called child experts say, children want boundaries. They want those boundaries set. They want to know what they can do and what they can't, even though they test them. And we as adults, I think we want things to be black and white. I can do what is black and white. I can do that.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't want to admit it. There's an awful lot of gray in the Bible, in our New Testament. There is an awful lot of gray. And I think we are guilty sometimes of doing the same thing, adding what we've always heard, and adding that to the gray. And I have been very guilty at times of pointing that out to forgive others. Well, they're not, but I want a different set of standards for my family, and I've been harder on them.
Yeah.
I've been very inconsistent.
That's exactly what's going on here.
At times.
We're inconsistent sometimes with ourselves, toward other people. Sometimes we're inconsistent because we hold other people to certain standards that we ourselves don't even keep. We might be harsh about somebody else's actions, yet we justify our own actions somehow.
I feel like we become complacent with the world instead of what we should be doing. Like, we're constantly like looking over and doing something that we shouldn't be. At the same time, we're trying to keep a standard of, we should love everyone and forgive everyone, but we're not doing that in our heads sometimes.
So maybe a bit hypocritical because, well, I'm doing things as a Christian. I say that, people shouldn't be doing those things, yet I'm doing some of these same things.
And also, we're just trying, the world has a standard, and we're trying to live up to the world standard because we want to fit in
Yeah.
when we shouldn't.
Yeah, and that causes a bit of a, it doesn't jive with Christianity, because we're not to be of the world. We're in it. We're not of it. But sometimes we live like we are of it, or we,
Many that aren't.
yeah.
So there's more harm than there is
Mm-hmm.
harm.
Yeah, yeah,
Couple of ways I've seen inconsistency. The things I struggle with, I tend to not be so judgmental about. But the things that are easy for me, they're doing that.
yeah,
Then, like, that's bad, but, no, like, I struggle with that, I can identify with that. Instead of, send us in.
mm-hmm.
Whether you struggle with it, whether it's a sin you don't struggle with, or a sin that you didn't. And the other thing, a very wise person pointed out, or
Yeah, or it's not that bad.
Right, instead of, we don't know what their intent was.
Right.
So we tend to point fingers and forgive ourselves.
Yeah, all this justifying goes on within ourselves all the time. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of doctrinal inconsistencies when someone starts pushing a certain, like child baptism or something, then they have to go and find a root cause and things like that, and they have to start changing doctrine in other ways to back up what they originally.
It's a patch on a patch on a patch. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that a lot with some of those things, Calvinism including.
You know, too, we can be inconsistent with ourselves.
Yeah.
We can hold ourselves to standards that maybe we shouldn't.
Absolutely. It can go all kinds of different areas, you know.
People are down to what were they watching, why were they watching, whose law were they trying to keep them of, what ways were they watching, our minds are not place. It's easier to project wrong on someone else to justify our own action.
Yeah.
So if you find someone in a public setting that you can accuse and ridicule in a kind of a subconscious sense that makes you feel better about your own justification.
Yeah.
And so that's why, I talk about Jews lying in wait, putting snares out for everybody.
Yeah.
Always setting traps, always setting little bitty breadcrumbs so they're
Mhm.
able to catch somebody in order to make themselves and their group look better
Right.
in a public setting.
Yeah.
So it's more about like an ego thing
Absolutely.
than, I guess, in a general sense of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when we condemn others, it does make us feel better,
Yeah, sometimes.
or it can.
It's not good, it's not right, but sometimes.
I'm not doing as bad as him or her, so
Yeah. You start measuring yourself, stacking yourself up.
it's very dangerous.
Sometimes we're inconsistent, just like the Pharisees, and we may or may not, like we've been talking about, hold the same standard up for somebody. Well, in this case, somebody maybe sometimes that we really revere, and we'll let them get a pass. Yet when somebody else that we don't really revere or respect does the same thing, we do get at them sometimes. I've seen that happen sometimes. There was I happened to just catch something on ESPN or some little short on YouTube or whatever. Deion Sanders had a meeting one time. He was coaching. His kids were still playing for him somewhere else, maybe even at Colorado. But Deion Sanders, he starts his meetings at 7. But if you're on time, you're late, kind of one of those deals. But he said most everybody is in the chair ready to go at about 6:55. Well, he was there. Everybody's ready to go. Here comes one of his boys. And he was late, basically. Everybody else is ready to go. The meeting is starting, and here comes his son. Well, one would think, well, you're Deion Sanders' son. You're not going to get in trouble, right? No, you know what happened? Deion benched him and said, I start my meetings at this time, right? You will be here, and so you are not going to play. Okay, but sometimes that's reversed, and, we, because of who somebody is, we may not hold that same standard. The starter comes in, the starting quarterback comes in late. You're good to go. So-and-so comes in who rides the bench all the time. Go to the stadium, you're running stairs. You see what I mean? This inconsistency sometimes. And sometimes it happens with people who we respect and sometimes or we don't respect. Right? That goes on from time to time. Sometimes we're inconsistent with how we use the Scriptures. Because sometimes we might try and use Scripture against people to criticize them or prove a point, but sometimes we may not fully understand what the Scriptures are saying, and we misuse it. We can misuse Scripture. And the Pharisees certainly did. They tried to say that something was unlawful that actually was lawful. And so we need to be careful about how we throw around God's Word. This inconsistency floats around in all kinds of areas. It's just something else we've got to watch out for. We've got to guard against it. All right? But those are some ways that we can be like the Pharisees, inconsistent like them. Now, Jesus says to them in verse 27, the Sabbath, continuing the conversation, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So Jesus handled this thing about what they called unlawful, and He's like, all right, let's talk about what's unlawful for a second. And He explained to them about what David did wasn't unlawful. And then He says, as for the Sabbath, all that the Sabbath was to be was a day of rest for your work all week. It wasn't meant to be turned into some restrictive day where you couldn't do a single thing. And the Sabbath was not created for man just to conform themselves to Sabbath laws all the time. The Sabbath was made for man, but the scribes and Pharisees are saying that man was practically made to obey all the Sabbath laws. And that's not true. And people walking around, people walking around and watching every move that somebody makes doesn't sound very restful to me. They haven't made the Sabbath a restful thing, they've made it a stressful thing. Yeah, who's keeping the Pharisees accountable? Nobody, because they run the show. What are you going to tell them, And oh, by the way, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So more Son of Man language. But Jesus is saying, now we saw that Son of Man language at the end of the paralytic, okay, when he was like, who are you to forgive sins? It's like, get up and walk. The Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. That goes back to Daniel 7, the whole prophecy, He has authority. Anyway, so we have it more here. And Jesus is saying that He has authority over the Sabbath as well. He's got authority to forgive people's sins while He's on earth. He's got authority over the Sabbath. Jesus isn't throwing out the Sabbath and the laws. Anything that God commanded, Jesus is going to tell them they should do. Absolutely. You remember, he told that to the paralytic, or when He cleansed the leper at the end of chapter 1. He's like, look, I've cleansed you. You still need to go make an offering to the priest. Okay? He's not throwing out the law. He's under the law. But Jesus is going to tell them that still the things that they should do, but He does have authority over it. He has authority over the Sabbath. So here's a summary kind of chapter 2. Okay. We see Jesus healing the paralytic. He demonstrates that He has authority to forgive sins by telling the man to get up and walk. We start seeing this mindset of the religious leaders and how they're not really flexible on accepting Jesus. Rather than being excited for the paralytic that was healed, they are reasoning in their hearts that Jesus is blaspheming by forgiving the man's sins. We see Jesus, He shows us that if you want to reach those who are lost, if you want to reach sinners, you've got to be willing to recline and dine. We talked about that. The Pharisees become fixated on why Jesus is doing what He's doing, and it's bothering them because it's not how they do things. Jesus is the new, they are the old, and we see the inconsistency of the Pharisees and how they are making law above God's law. There's kind of a rough breakdown of chapter 2. All right?
And two, you see kind of an absence of love
Oh, yeah.
and concern for others.
Yeah, you absolutely see it with the paralytic healed.
They were, and they did know the law and they wanted to keep it, but I think they missed Jesus' point to where, hey, we got to start taking care of people.
Yeah.
Not be
And there's an attitude right there that we need to guard against. Sometimes, like, the paralytic was healed. He was sick, he couldn't walk, he was, for however long. Yet when the guy's healed, you don't see celebration from the Pharisees. All that you see is a pointing a finger at Jesus because what are you doing? You don't have authority to do that, I think sometimes we can get that way too. If somebody is healed or whatever and we want to Who cares about their healing? Who cares about them becoming a Christian now and getting off drugs? And who cares about, anything like that? Let's just point the finger at them and say, well, they're still not doing this. Another attitude that really we need to guard against. All right, chapter 3. Anybody questions for chapter 2? All right. So he entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. They were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. All right, so we kind of have another old wineskin, new wine deal here. They had another law in the Mishnah, in this right here, Yoma 8:6, Mishnah Yoma 8:6, that basically dealt with not healing on the Sabbath unless someone's life was in jeopardy. Okay? And here's what it says. Quickly. In the case of one who is seized with the life-threatening illness, bulmus, causing him unbearable hunger pangs and impaired vision, one may feed him even impure foods on Yom Kippur or any other day until his eyes recover, as the return of his sight indicates that he is recovering. In the case of one whom a mad dog bit, one may not feed him from the lobe of the dog's liver. This was thought to be a remedy for the bite, but the rabbis deem it ineffective. I told you, these are teachings that rabbis taught. Look what they're doing. So they say, the rabbis deem it ineffective, and Rabbi Matya ben Harash permits feeding it to him as he deems it effective. You see, Rabbi so-and-so says this. Okay? Rabbi Matya ben Harash permits feeding it to him as he deems it effective. And furthermore, Rabbi Matya ben Harash said, you remember Jesus calling that out in Matthew chapter 5, you have heard that it was said, kind of like this right here, said, with regard to one who suffers pain in his throat, one may place medicine inside his mouth on Shabbat, that's Sabbath, although administering a remedy is prohibited on Shabbat. This is because there is uncertainty whether or not it is a life-threatening situation for him, as it is difficult to ascertain the severity of internal pain, and a case of uncertainty concerning a life-threatening situation overrides Shabbat. That's a mouthful, but that gives you a little insight into their mindset. Okay? So, they couldn't give somebody medicine unless they may or may not know that something is life-threatening. That they would have a pass then to administer something on the Sabbath. Now, here, it doesn't appear that this man is having the internal pain or that his life is in jeopardy. It just says that his hand was withered. So, being that his life doesn't seem to be in jeopardy, they're watching to see what Jesus is about to do, so that they might accuse him. And then they'll say, aha, he broke a law on the Sabbath. We've got him now. You following me? Is this making sense? Okay. But here's the thing. Oh man, I missed it. This is their law, not God's law. This is their law that says this, not God's law. So they are looking to accuse him based on what they have made up. And this word for accuse, it means to bring legal charges against. So they're watching in order to charge him legally because he broke their law. Now, let's stop there for just a second while we still have a little time. And let's focus on this word right here. Oh man, I had it backwards. Watching. How do you think the Pharisees watching him applies to today? pretty easy to see, isn't it?
He said we, I
Right. We watch. You can go ahead. Sometimes, sometimes people watch so that they might accuse. Sometimes people watch so that they can accuse them. And it may not be so that they can bring legal charges against them, but they are watching to accuse them of breaking God's law. Sometimes it's a law that even they have made up, that isn't God's law. And they're just waiting for the opportunity for somebody to slip up and accuse them of not being the kind of Christian they should be. People do that. People do that. And a lot of times it does come from non-Christians waiting for that gotcha moment against a Christian. I've seen that happen. And catch them in a moment of weakness. But it also happens with Christian to Christian as well sometimes, because sometimes we're on the constant lookout for things that people do that might not be scriptural. Yes, we need to watch out and make sure things are going according to Scripture, but if we're just playing police, then our minds are not in the right place. Does that make sense? And neither is your heart. Now, if you notice, where is this happening? What does it say? Yeah.
Israel and Palestine.
Well, yes, but where? In the text, what's he say? You're good. In 3:1 and 2.
synagogue, in the synagogue.
In the synagogue. On what day? The Sabbath. This is happening in the synagogue on the Sabbath, but what are they supposed to be doing at that place and at that time? Yeah. Yes. They're supposed to be worshiping. Instead, they're watching Jesus to see if He's going to break Sabbath law or not, or their Sabbath law. Sometimes we fall into that too. And when we go into worship, we may catch ourselves looking at others and measuring their spirituality. And sometimes we may watch to see if that person is really singing or not. You know, we cut our eyes over there. Are they really singing? Or we may kind of scan the room during the sermon to see who's actually paying attention. You know, or who's cutting up during the Lord's Supper, or who's sitting there scrolling social media during worship. And instead of worshiping, we're watching. Instead of worshiping, we're watching. And we start measuring people's spirituality based on what we're watching and seeing. But is that what we're there to do during worship? To just sit back and watch everybody? Is that what we're there to do? No. We need to be there to focus on God, not there to accuse. We ought to be focusing, not accusing.